Throughout history, prophecies and lessons from God have always been a source of light to guide people through all challenges. One of the most challenging and mysterious stories in the Bible is about the fate of Ishmael, the son of Abraham and Hagar, who became the father of the Arab people. Although Ishmael was not the chosen one to inherit God's promise, his role in the history and future of the Arab nations cannot be denied. Recently, a father of an Arab nation revealed a shocking truth about the fate of Ishmael and the far-reaching implications it has for modern peoples and nations. This truth not only changes the way we understand Bible prophecy, but it also illuminates an essential message about the connection between peoples, between past and present, and between God's promise to humanity. Let's explore the lessons of this story and how it can guide us in our quest for peace and salvation. Number 1. Children of the Promise, Ishmael and the Destiny of the Nation. Ishmael, the firstborn son of Abraham and Hagar, is an essential figure in the Bible, but is often overshadowed by Isaac, who is considered the heir to God's covenant. However, Ishmael's story is not simply that of a forgotten son. God's promise to him and his descendants carries a profound message, reflecting God's concern for all the world's peoples, not just Israel. Ishmael first appears in Genesis chapter 16, when Abraham's wife Sarah is unable to bear children. Although God had promised Abraham that he would become the father of many nations, when Sarah was childless, she asked Abraham to have a child with Hagar, her slave, and thus Ishmael was born. However, the relationship between Hagar and Sarah quickly became strained when Hagar became pregnant, and Hagar cast out in sorrow. Although Ishmael was not the heir to the covenant of God that Abraham had received, God still kept his promise to him. In Genesis 16:12 and 12, an angel of the Lord came to Hagar as she fled from Sarah's oppression and announced Ishmael's future. "You are pregnant, and you will bear a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man, and his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand shall be against him, and he shall live among his brothers." This prophecy not only describes Ishmael's character and the trials of his life, but also predicts a future filled with conflict between Ishmael's descendants and the descendants of Isaac, the true heir to God's covenant. Despite not receiving the covenant, Ishmael still gets the promise of a great nation. God told Abraham in Genesis 17:20 that Ishmael will become the father of a great nation, affirming that Ishmael's descendants would significantly influence the world. This is further reinforced in Genesis 25:12 through 16, where the identities of Ishmael's 12 sons are recorded. These were not only the sons of Ishmael, but also the leaders of tribes, each leading a distinct nation. The richness and diversity of these nations, as reflected in the modern nations and cultures of the Middle East and North Africa, is a testament to the prosperity that God promised to Ishmael. Although not specifically saved by the covenant, the survival and prosperity of these nations demonstrates that God's promise to Ishmael was not in vain. God did not forsake him, but rather, God made a great nation out of Ishmael. These nations now have far-reaching influence and play a significant role in shaping world events. The lesson of Ishmael's story is that God always keeps his promises, whether we see them fulfilled in the way we expect or not. God's promise to Ishmael is a testament to God's boundless love for all the nations of the world. Although there was no special covenant of salvation for Ishmael and his descendants, God's promise of prosperity and greatness for them still proved that all nations matter in his eyes. Ishmael is a forgotten son in God's grand story, but his story is an important part of God's plan. It is a reminder to us of God's faithfulness, of how he cares for all peoples, and of the perfection of his plans, even when we don't fully understand them. Ultimately, Ishmael's story is not only a lesson in God's promises, but also a reminder of our own faithfulness and patience in life. God always keeps his promises, and even though we are not heirs to his covenant, we are still part of his great plan because he loves us all. Number 2. Lessons from Ishmael, prophecy and confrontation. In the story of Ishmael, told in Genesis 16, we witness a journey filled with challenges and contradictions, but also a meaningful account of God's concern for the abandoned. It is a story not only about family conflict, but also about God's prophecies and their fulfillment in history. Sarah, Abraham's wife, had been suffering from infertility for many years. In ancient society, a wife who could not bear children would allow her servant to bear a child for her, and the child would be considered hers. In this situation, Sarah decided to let Hagar, her servant, bear Abraham's child, hoping that this would solve the problem of an heir. Hagar became pregnant and gave birth to Ishmael. However, Sarah's decision led to a tense situation between her and Hagar. Hagar, with her pride, the mother who became arrogant towards Sarah, hurt her feelings. The discord between the two became more serious, and eventually Sarah asked Abraham to send Hagar away. Hagar, heartbroken and desperate, fled into the desert. There, in her loneliness and despair, Hagar met an angel of the Lord. The angel not only comforted her, but also gave her a critical mission: to return to and serve Sarah. God's promise to Hagar was a powerful prophecy, a promise about the future of her son Ishmael. The angel said that Ishmael would become a great nation, but would also face hardship and conflict throughout his life. God named the child Ishmael, meaning God has heard, reflecting God's care and love for Hagar. Despite being abandoned, God heard her cry and did not leave her alone in her hardship. The prophecy about Ishmael reveals an important truth. No matter what the circumstances, God always hears and answers the cries of those who are suffering. God's prophecy about Ishmael not only speaks of a great future, but also emphasizes Ishmael's character. God describes Ishmael as a wild man, whose hand will be against everyone. This is not only a description of Ishmael's character, but also a prophecy of the conflicts and contradictions that will take place between Ishmael and others, especially between Ishmael's descendants and Isaac's descendants. The relationship between them will always be one of confrontation, without harmony. However, this prophecy also reflects an important reality. Despite the conflicts and difficulties, God still has a plan for everything. The people that Ishmael would form, the Arabs, have become an essential part of the world, with far-reaching influence in the Middle East and globally. But as the prophecy says, they will face challenges and tensions, especially with the Jewish people. The relationship between Ishmael and Isaac is a symbol of the conflict between these two lineages. It is not just a personal issue for the two women in the story, but has become part of the history and politics of the region. The conflicts between the Arabs and the Jews have lasted for thousands of years and continue to this day. This is a clear demonstration that God's prophecy always has a profound and lasting influence. Although this conflict is part of history and the present, the prophecy about Ishmael also offers hope. God did not abandon Hagar and her son, and despite the trials Ishmael faced, God promised to protect her and her son. This reminds us that no matter how many trials we face in life, God is always listening and has a good plan for each of us. So, the story of Ishmael is not only a story of family conflict, but also an important lesson about God's listening and mercy. No matter what the circumstances, we must remember that God is always there, listening and protecting those who trust in Him. The prophecy of Ishmael is also a reminder of perseverance in faith, that trials and suffering are not a sign of abandonment, but part of God's great plan for each of us. In this life, no matter what difficulties or conflicts we face, we can find comfort in God's promises. He always listens and will never abandon us. It is in difficult times that we need to trust in God's care and unconditional love, just as He cared for Hagar and Ishmael in the desert. Number 3. The legacy of faith, the continuing journey of Elisha and Elijah. Elisha's life and work is not simply a continuation of Elijah's, but also a lesson in the transmission of faith, as well as the connection between generations in the service of God. This legacy includes not only the power and prophetic works that Elijah left behind, but also the responsibility to maintain and develop God's work on earth. When Elisha received power from Elijah, he not only asked for the same power as Elijah, but also prayed for himself to have double the power of Elijah. 2 Kings 2:9. This is a prayer expressing the desire to continue Elijah's legacy, but with greater power, with the desire to carry out God's work more powerfully and effectively. This prayer is a symbol of the reception and development of the work that Elijah built, and at the same time shows the commitment and importance of passing on the faith to the next generation. The life of Elisha had a great responsibility, not simply to continue the work that Elisha had done. Elisha had a great mission: to pass on the faith and understanding of God to the next generation. Every action of Elisha, from healing the sick to teaching, reflected this responsibility. He did not work alone, but always maintained a community of believers. Elisha's disciples were the ones who would continue the work of God, bringing his message to the people. A clear example of the continuation of the legacy is when Elisha taught and trained his disciples. In 2 Kings 14:38 through 44, Elisha not only acted as a prophet, but also acted as a teacher, guiding and instructing the disciples on how to know and serve God. This is a clear demonstration that Elisha passed on not only miracles, but also living lessons about faith and living according to God's will. The following generations were taught not only theory, but also concrete actions in daily life. The relationship between Elisha and the prophetic community was not only a teacher-student relationship, but also mutual support in the work of God. The story of Elisha shows that in the work of God, no one is called to serve alone. Each person needs support and encouragement from the community to be able to complete the assigned task. Elisha received help from the disciples and became part of the community of believers. While he was a leader, his work could not be completed without the support of his followers. This reminds us that in the journey of faith, no one should be alone. Every believer needs the support of the community in serving God. Therefore, each of us needs to live our faith not only as a personal journey, but also as part of a larger community work, helping and supporting those around us. Elisha not only continued Elisandra's legacy, but also focused on preparing the next generation. He trained the disciples, prepared them for God's work, and led them in the faith. Therefore, Elisha's work was not only to continue a legacy, but also it was also a preparation for those who would succeed him in the future. This highlights the importance of preparing the next generation so that they can continue God's work and develop faith through the generations. The legacy that Elisha left behind was not just the miracles or wonders he performed. It was also his faithfulness, patience, and a strong faith in God's work. Elisha passed on valuable lessons about living according to God's will, about love and forgiveness. These lessons were passed on through words and concrete actions, showing that faith is not just a theory, but a practical way of life. Today, the story of Elisha and Elijah reminds us of the importance of passing on the faith to the next generation. This is not only the responsibility of religious leaders, but also the responsibility of each individual in the community. Each of us needs to live in such a way that our faith can be effectively passed on to younger generations, so that they can continue God's work in the future. Faith succession is not just a theoretical exercise, but a practical action in daily life. Each of us, from leaders to individual believers, has a part to play in building and protecting the legacy of faith. We pass on not only the teachings of God, but also our acts of love, forgiveness, and faithfulness to what God has taught. Elisha's legacy was not only the miracles he performed, but also the passing on of faith to the next generation. This shows that God's work is not only about what we do in this life, but also about how we prepare those who will follow us in God's great work. So let's live, so our faith can be fully passed on to the next generation. Always remember that faith is not just a part of our personal lives, but part of the greater work that God has given us. Be faithful to God's work, pass on the faith to the next generation, and build a strong community, ready to serve God in all circumstances. The legacy of faith that Elijah and Elijah left us is not just about miraculous works, but a lesson in loyalty, patience, and love. Always remember that God's work is never finished, and each generation has the responsibility to continue and develop that legacy. Number 4. Family War, the feud between Ishmael and Isaac. The family war between Ishmael and Isaac is a biblical story and a prophecy of tensions that continue in history and politics today. This feud began in Abraham's family and lasted for generations, profoundly influencing essential events in the modern Arab-Israeli conflict. Let's look at this story through God's eyes, to better understand the significance of this conflict in His great plan. When Abraham's wife Sarah was unable to bear children for many years, she decided to have Abraham marry Hagar, her Egyptian slave, in the hope of having an heir. Hagar became pregnant and gave birth to Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn. However, when Isaac, Abraham's son with Sarah, was born, the tension in the family became even more intense. Sarah, feeling that Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael away, demanded that Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away. This feud was not only a dispute over inheritance rights, but also reflected feelings of humiliation and jealousy between the wives. Sarah could not bear to see Hagar, whom she had chosen to bear Abraham's child, as the mother of her firstborn. This hatred and jealousy created a deep conflict between the two women and also divided the relationship between the two children, Ishmael and Isaac. However, God did not abandon Hagar and Ishmael in their time of need. When they were driven into the desert and faced death, God intervened. In Genesis 21:17-18, when Hagar was weeping, God sent an angel to comfort her. He affirmed that he had heard Ishmael's cries and told her not to be afraid. God's promise to Hagar was that Ishmael would become a great nation, even though he was not a direct heir to the covenant God made with Isaac. "Arise, lift your son, and take hold of his hand, for I will make him a great nation." Genesis 21:18. Even though he was not a direct heir to the promise, Ishmael and his descendants became a great nation, and this promise was fulfilled through the rise of the Arab tribes. However, the tension between the descendants of Ishmael and Isaac never ended. This feud lasted through the generations and still affects current political events, especially in the conflict between Israel and the Arab nations. This generational conflict was not just a territorial dispute, but also a war of beliefs and religions. The war between the Jews and the Arabs today still reflects the deep rivalry between these peoples, which has its roots in past family conflicts. These conflicts were not just conflicts within Abraham's family, but were also part of God's grand plan as a sign of future events. The Bible shows that this conflict was not simply a family fight but a symbol of greater confrontations to come. Books such as Psalm 83 and Revelation describe wars between nations against Israel, including nations involving the descendants of Ishmael. These wars are seen as part of end-time prophecies, when the nations will rise against Israel in a final war before the return of Christ. In the context of these prophecies, we see not only conflict between nations, but also a reminder of the restoration and salvation that God will bring. Wars and conflicts are not just temporary events, but part of God's plan of salvation. The return of Christ will end all these wars, and those who are faithful to him will receive the restoration and peace he has promised. The feud between Ishmael and Isaac is a story not only of the past, but also a warning to us today. These confrontations are not only of the past, but continue in modern political and religious conflicts. But we must not forget that despite the difficulties and challenges, God remains faithful to his promises. He will guide and protect those who are faithful to him, and the final restoration will come when Christ returns. Number 5. Ishmael's legacy, secrets from the past and impact on the future. Throughout the course of human history, God's promises have always been steadfast and hopeful. One of those great promises was given to Ishmael, the son of Abraham and Hagar. Through Ishmael, God promised to create a great nation, and this legacy continues to be demonstrated in the powerful rise of the Arab countries today, with far-reaching influence across the globe. Ishmael's legacy is reflected not only in ancient historical stories, but also in modern political, religious, and economic events. The Arab nations, descendants of Ishmael, are now essential in reshaping the world map. From mighty empires to oil-rich nations, this legacy continues to live on in every step of history and the future. The rise of the Islamic Empire. In the 7th century, a monumental event forever changed the course of world history. The rise of the Islamic Empire under the leadership of Muhammad. He not only spread a religion, but also built a great civilization that spread across continents. Although the Muslim nations of today have political and cultural differences, their power and influence remain strong across the globe. From the Middle East to distant regions, Saudi Arabia, the hub of faith and power. Saudi Arabia is at the forefront of the Muslim world. Mecca and Medina, the two holiest cities of Islam, are indispensable places in the minds of millions of believers. Saudi Arabia's position comes not only from religion, but also from the wealth it has gained from oil, which has helped the country not only become prosperous, but also rise to become a power in the Muslim world and on the international stage. The country plays a key role in global politics, with its significant influence. Political interactions between Muslim countries. The political landscape of the Middle East has always been complex, with tense relations between countries. The relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran is a prime example of the confrontation between the two religious branches, Sunni and Shia. This long-standing struggle has caused conflicts in many countries, from Syria to Yemen and Iraq. However, in recent years, the picture has changed positively, especially when some countries, such as the United Arab Emirates (UAE), signed peace treaties with Israel through the Abraham Accords. This is a clear demonstration of changing attitudes in the region, especially the general concern about Iran's growing influence. Oil wealth. One of the important elements of Ishmael's legacy is oil. The Middle East, home to most of the Arab countries, has some of the world's largest oil reserves. Oil production and exports have brought prosperity to these countries, helping them build modern infrastructure, improve their quality of life, and consolidate their political power. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar have become economic powerhouses, with cities like Dubai and Abu Dhabi becoming international financial centers. As a key member of OPEC, Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, Saudi Arabia not only has a profound influence on the oil industry, but is also a major political force in the region and globally. Its power is not only based on its oil wealth, but also on its strategic location and leadership role in the Muslim world. Global geopolitical impact. Arab countries not only have strong economies, but also have a profound influence on global political and security issues. The changing relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel are a prime example of major shifts in Arab foreign policy. While the relationship remains challenging, improving ties with Israel reflects a new regional strategy. In addition, the ongoing rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran remains a major factor in shaping regional politics. This rivalry affects not only Middle Eastern countries, but also has far-reaching implications for global policy, particularly in energy and international security. Number 6. The Last War and the Return of the Lord. Biblical prophecy, especially passages in Psalm 83 and the Book of Revelation, strongly connects with the story of Ishmael and Isaac, the two sons of Abraham. The conflict between these two lines, one from Isaac, a Jew, and the other from Ishmael, an Arab, is not only a family feud, but also a symbol of end-time events. These prophecies are believed by many to be fulfilled in the near future, especially when Christ returns. The war between the nations against Israel described in Psalm 83 is part of the Old Testament prophetic books. Psalm 83 is not only a prayer for protection, but also a prophecy of a coalition of nations that will unite to destroy Israel in the last days. The prayer in this psalm is a call to God to act to protect His people in the context of enemies plotting to destroy Israel. Rem Kishebels. They say, "Come, let us destroy them as a nation, that Israel may not be remembered anymore." Psalm 83, 4-5. Nations and peoples in the Middle East, with deep ties to the descendants of Ishmael, such as Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, will join together in this alliance. These are nations that have close ties to the Arabs, the descendants of Ishmael. Therefore, many scholars and prophets believe that the war in Psalm 83 will be part of the apocalyptic events, when the Arab nations will join forces to attack Israel in order to wipe it off the map. The description in the book of Revelation, especially in chapters 16 and 19, speaks of the final battle at Armageddon, where the nations will gather to fight against God and His army. This battle is not just a confrontation between countries, but also a confrontation between the descendants of Isaac, the Jews, and the descendants of Ishmael, the Arabs. The Arab nations will join forces against Israel, marking the revival of the family conflict between the two families. Revelation 16:16 says, "They will gather together at the place called Armageddon. This will be the final battle between good and evil, where Christ will be victorious and bring everlasting peace to the earth." Armageddon is not just a war between nations, but a confrontation between the forces of God and the forces of evil, ending with His victory. This ushers in a time of everlasting peace and justice. The conflict between Isaac and Ishmael is not a family affair, but reflects a deep division between peoples. This conflict begins in childhood, when Isaac is the son of Sarah, Abraham's legal wife, and Ishmael is the son of Hagar, Sarah's servant. When Sarah gives birth to Isaac, the discord between the two mothers and between the two sons creates irreconcilable conflicts. As a result, Ishmael is banished from the family. This conflict is not only a personal matter, but also reflects a deep division between peoples and religions. Biblical scholars and modern prophets believe that this conflict still exists and develops into political and military conflicts in the Middle East. The conflict between Isaac and Ishmael has become a major war between Israel and the Arab countries. Furthermore, It was not only a war between peoples, but also a religious war, where the Jews believed that they were the rightful heirs of the promise that God made to Abraham. At the same time, the Arabs, especially those who followed Islam, considered Ishmael their ancestor and therefore had the right to claim the territories that Israel occupied. This tension continues to this day, manifested in the wars between Israel and the Arab nations. This was a political confrontation and a profound conflict of beliefs and interests. God foretold that in the last days, this conflict would escalate and lead to a great war between nations and peoples, especially between Israel and the Arab countries. Before the second coming of Christ, prophetic events such as Psalm 83 and the book of Revelation would begin to be fulfilled. The nations would be gathered against Israel, which would be Purisamadal, a clear sign of the return of Christ. In this final battle, God will defeat the forces of darkness and establish His kingdom on earth. God's followers will receive glory, and Israel will be placed at the center of His plan of salvation. The return of Christ is a pivotal moment in the Bible, when He will fulfill prophecies and give Israel the highest place in God's plan of salvation. It is a time when all conflict will end, and a time of peace, justice, and glory will be established. But before this happens, the final battle at Armageddon will take place, a powerful demonstration of God's supremacy over all the forces of evil. Number 7. Between Two Bloods, the unending war between Isaac and Ishmael. The conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis, and especially between the Jews and the Arab nations, is one of the longest and most complex conflicts in modern history. However, if we look at its deep roots, this war is not only the result of political or territorial conflicts, but also a continuation of the ancient biblical dispute between the two brothers Isaac and Ishmael. The story begins long ago, when Sarah, Abraham's wife, was unable to bear children. In frustration, she asked her husband to have a child with Hagar, her servant. Ishmael, Hagar's son, was the brother of Isaac, the legitimate son of Abraham and Sarah. When Sarah gave birth to Isaac, she asked Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away, causing tension between the two families. Although Ishmael was not the son of his legitimate wife, he was still the son of Abraham and have a stake in the family legacy. The feud between these two families was sown and continues to this day. The historical reality of the Israeli-Arab conflict became apparent in 1948 when Israel declared its independence. Arab states immediately attacked Israel, not recognizing its existence and viewing its establishment as an invasion of the historical Palestinian and Arab lands. The conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors has never stopped since then, erupting in battles, attacks, and failed peace negotiations. The 1948-1949 War, also known as the Israeli War of Independence, was one of the first major conflicts. After Israel declared its independence in May 1948, Arab states including Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon attacked Israel. The war ended with a ceasefire that allowed Israel to maintain its existence, but also captured more territory than the United Nations had originally planned. Known to Palestinians as the Nakba, meaning catastrophe, the event saw hundreds of thousands of Palestinians forced from their homes. Then, in 1956, Israel, along with Britain and France, attacked Egypt in the Suez War, after Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. Although the tripartite alliance struggled to achieve its military goals, the event increased tensions between Arab states and Israel. In 1967, the Six-Day War broke out, and Israel emerged victorious. In the war, Israel occupied the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, all of which were disputed territories. This event not only changed the map of the Middle East, but also increased the conflict with the Arab states and the Palestinians. The next war, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, was another major war between Israel and the Arab states. Although Israel emerged victorious, the conflict continues to this day, with no lasting peace settlement found. Although the wars continue, peace efforts have been made. The 1978 Camp David Agreement between Israel and Egypt resulted in Egypt recognizing Israel and Israel withdrawing from the Sinai. The 1993 Oslo Accords between Israel and the Palestinians made some progress toward establishing a Palestinian self-government, but a comprehensive solution has yet to be found. Today, the conflict between Israel and the Arab states is far from over. One of the main issues remains the rights of the Palestinian people. Palestinians continue to call for self-determination and the establishment of an independent state with East Jerusalem as its capital. Meanwhile, Israel remains steadfast in defending its territorial integrity and its control of Jerusalem, which it regards as its eternal capital. This conflict is not just a matter between two nations or two peoples, but also a dispute between two bloodlines, between two sons of Abraham. This is not just a war over territory, but also a struggle over succession, over rights and honor. Whether or not the parties involved find a peaceful solution, one thing is sure: the continuation of this dispute has existed for thousands of years. These events not only reflect a conflict between two peoples, but also testify to the biblical truth about the continuation of the enmity between Isaac and Ishmael. This conflict is a reminder of the importance of peace and forgiveness in a world facing so many challenges. No matter the circumstances, we must remember that God's promises never change, and He will always be on the side of those seeking justice and peace. While we cannot change the past, we can learn from its mistakes and build a better future. Peace, as the Bible teaches, is the result of compromise and kindness. It is the responsibility of every person and every nation to seek reconciliation and trust in God's guidance. Number 8. God's promises and reestablishment. God's promises are a constant theme throughout the Bible, reminding us that He is faithful to what He has said. These promises are not only a guarantee for the present, but also a source of hope for the future. Through the generations, from the time of Abraham to today, God's promises of salvation and peace have never changed, and in the lives of each person, we can still see the fulfillment of those promises. The promise to Isaac and his descendants. God chose Isaac, Abraham's son, to be the special heir of His promise. In Genesis 17:19-20, God said to Abraham, "I will establish my covenant with you, and you will have descendants. Through Isaac, I will establish my covenant with you." This is the promise of a great nation and a promised land for Isaac's descendants. This promise is not only about a physical nation, but also about the salvation and peace that the people of Israel would experience throughout their history. Over the centuries, the people of Israel have endured many hardships, being enslaved in Egypt, living in exile, and being invaded by powerful empires. But God's promise of a great nation and a promised land has always been fulfilled. The resurrection of Israel in 1948 is clear evidence that God's promise has never changed and that He is still carrying out His great plan of salvation, the promise to Ishmael's descendants. Although Isaac was chosen to continue God's covenant, Ishmael, Abraham's older son by Hagar, also received a promise from God. In Genesis 17:20, God says, "I will make of you a great nation, but I will make of you a great nation, my covenant will be with Isaac." The promise to Ishmael was not the same as the promise to Isaac, but God still promised that Ishmael's descendants would become a mighty nation, which has come true. The Arab nations such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the Gulf states are living examples of this promise. These nations have flourished and become regional powers, demonstrating the prosperity and power that God promised to Ishmael's descendants. Final peace and the return of Christ. One of the great prophecies in the Bible is that final peace will only come when Christ returns, fulfilling God's plan for reconciliation. The long-standing conflict between the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael will be resolved when Christ returns, and all nations will recognize Him as the Lord of all nations. In Isaiah 19:23-25, there is a clear prophecy of peace among nations, including Israel, Egypt, and Assyria. On that day, declares the Lord, Israel will be 3 legs of a table with Egypt and Assyria, and the Lord of hosts will bless them and say, "Blessed are Egypt, blessed are Assyria, blessed are Israel." This is a prophecy of a day when nations that have long been at war will find reconciliation under the leadership of Christ. Finally, in Revelation 19:11 and 16, the Bible describes the return of Christ, who will return to defeat the forces of evil and establish a kingdom of everlasting peace. God will bring reconciliation between Isaac and Ishmael, and all people will know the truth about Him, ending all conflict and bringing everlasting peace. The fulfillment of promises in today's world. Looking back through history from the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael to today, we see that God's promises never fail. Even as times change, these promises are still miraculously fulfilled. God promised salvation to the nation of Israel and prosperity to the descendants of Ishmael, and we live in a time when those promises are coming true. The restoration of Israel and the growth of the Arab countries is clear evidence that God is still working out His plan in this world. However, these are not the end, but signs that a great future awaits us. In our journey of discovering the lessons of God, we cannot help but take a deep look at the role of Ishmael in the history and survival of peoples, especially the Arab nations. God has given each people a distinct mission. With Ishmael, despite facing many challenges and events, God's promises remain steadfast. Ishmael, although he was the son of Abraham, received exceptional care from God. God never abandoned this people, but on the contrary, He promised to make Ishmael's descendants a great nation. This truth reminds us of God's unconditional love for all people, regardless of their past or origin. Ishmael's story also brings lessons of forgiveness and restoration. Despite mistakes and suffering, God always opens the door to restoration and hope. This applies not only to individuals, but also to nations, especially when faced with challenges in the modern world. Hopefully, this lesson will help you gain a deeper understanding of God's love and justice for all nations. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the content sharing about spiritual lessons from God in the following topics.